Greetings, Column 600. This is Ben Frazier. Hope you're reading the Craddock book. And I just wanted to spend a little time with you, seeing if I could frame this book for you so you know what to look at. Yesterday when I made the announcement, I told you that it is a book from a scholar and theologian and pastor to seminary students, homiletics, who teaches homiletics. And what he's trying to do is help them overcome a challenge that homiletic students have today when communicating the gospel. And so, first, why would I have you read a book from another area? Well, most of the theories and many of the books in communication are informed by theories and scholars from other areas, like education, like psychology, like sociology, and like theology. So really what the challenge is with this book is to take a book that is written for seminary students and make it applicable to communication professionals and artists in our field. And I think that there's something that isn't being said anywhere else that is said very clearly and powerfully in this book. And so that's in part why I assigned this book. So what is Craddock trying to say? And he's really communicating this from a scholar, a Danish scholar called Kierkegaard, who lived in Copenhagen from 1813 to 1855 and wrote about communication. He wrote about particularly two kinds of communication, direct and indirect communication. And Craddock, I think, simplifies this. So I'm not having you read Kierkegaard, I'm reading Craddock so that you begin to understand that. Now, one of the things Kierkegaard says, and I think it comes through there, is there are two reasons to communicate. One is for information. If you have an information problem, if a person doesn't know, let's say if there's a fire in the building, you don't have to tell a story. You don't have to say a phrase or give a metaphor. You can just be very, very direct, very much to the point, very propositional. There is a fire, you need to get out. However, that's not always the context in which the communication is given. And for Kierkegaard, he felt the context of the church of his day was such that people thought they understood what Christianity was, when in fact they didn't. Now, this is a problem that many situations for communication, not just theology, but many communicators have. They have the problem of communicating something to people that do not want to hear the message, or think they already know the message, or are bored by the message, or maybe some kind of emotionally resistant to that message. In the area of film, they call that defamiliarization. You have to take something that is already known or thought to be known, or there's a perception about, and you have to defamiliarize that thing and give then a new meaning or a more accurate meaning to that object or to that idea or to that. Now, let me give you an example. I've been studying this for the last 5 or 6 years, and in fact just finished the first draft of a book on this whole area. And Craddock is actually central to it. And I think it's one of the most important communication issues that we face today. And I really don't see any other book that I know of that's really addressing these things. And I think that a new book is needed. He wrote to seminary students, the book that I'm trying to address is to communication professionals and artists. Here's what the story first. When I was first teaching the class, there was a young woman in the class who had come from Louisiana with her husband and her 3 children and her sister. And so she was taking the class, and it was in the summer, and they were going to enjoy the beach during that time. So they were at the beach, and the first day I introduced this whole topic. One of the texts was this book, and we had other books by Kierkegaard and other scholars. And the second day, in the middle of class, she started laughing a little bit. And there were like 15 people in the class, and we all turned. You're not supposed to have your phones on in class, but for somehow, her husband had sent her a text. And we said, you got to share what you're doing, because you're laughing in the middle of class. And it was in good humor, but we said, we want to know what this is. Why are you laughing? And she says, well, let me tell you what's going on. in my family. My husband picked me up after the first class. It was Tuesday, so the first class was on Monday. Said my husband picked me up, and we went out to have some coffee before we went back with the kids and my sister. And we started talking about the day, and he wanted to know what it is I was studying. I told him this indirect. And he says, well, what is that? And when I started to explain it to him, he got the idea. He said, you know what? We have 3 children, and one of them is a boy who really should have been potty trained by then, who they were for the last several months trying to get him to learn to be potty trained. They bought a little potty that sits on the toilet for him to sit on. It wouldn't have anything to do with it. They bought him his own that he sat all alone. Wouldn't have anything to do. They tried to bribe him with M&Ms. They tried to pay him and say, if you do this, we'll give you, a favorite candy. None of those things were working. He wouldn't have anything to do with it. And he says, maybe we need to try a different way. It sounds like this method would be useful. And so they said, okay. And so she said, yeah, let's try it. So together for the next half hour or so, they came up, they said, first, what is the story he likes? Because this indirect approach, not going right and telling him what to do, this indirect approach is usually story-oriented or narrative-oriented, but not always. Sometimes it's provocative, and sometimes it's humor and other kinds of metaphors or things like that. But most of the time, it's always veiled. It's not direct. And so what they knew is that he loved pirate stories, Pirates of the Caribbean. And he absolutely loved anything pirates. And so they said, well, let's make up a story. And they made up the story there. And so they went home. And that night, of course, they told him the story. He loved it. He absolutely was taken by it. Before he went to bed, he wanted to hear the story again. And so, of course, they told him the story. And when she woke up in the morning, he was by their bed wanting to hear the story again. And the story was about the pirates fighting and the pirates meeting the other ship, and they swung across on ropes, and they had all the sword fights and that sort of thing. And then when the pirate captain was done, he went up and he sat on the throne. And then he made it rain. Now, they didn't tell him what sitting on the throne meant. They didn't tell him what made it rain meant. They didn't even mention potty training. They just told him this narrative story. Now, why she was laughing that second day is that even though they told him the story this many times and he loved the story, they never made that connection. She said during the middle of the day, her husband just texted her that the son came up, grabbed him by the shirt and pulled him into the bathroom and said, pointing at the toilet, "Is that the throne?" And so somehow he was able to figure that out. And of course he said yes. Well, that's all. He didn't start sitting on it, but he figured that out. Of course, he wanted to hear the story again. And that night, and so the next day we found out this. So we're all laughing about that. And so the next day when she came in on Wednesday, we all want to know what happened. And she said, he wanted to sit on the throne. And she said, and yes, he made it rain. Now, that was several years ago. I followed Elizabeth for all these years. She said her son was potty trained within 2 weeks after that. He was totally done. And that interesting thing is she said also her other son, they had to have a different story because he didn't like pirates as much, so they made up with something else. But they did the same sort of thing, and he was potty trained using this method. Now, okay, that's kind of a crude method and kind of simplistic. But my point is this, that indirect communication is very, very important when there is an emotional barrier to accepting that message. Just as Nathan had to confront David, a position of power. How do you do that? You don't always do it best by a direct method. You have to find different means of indirect communication. In other words, veiled or hidden communication to really communicate your message. And that's what Craddock is talking about, that not all problems are informational problems like you might see or expect in a modernist world that just deals with the mind. That many times, advertisements have already figured this out. Most advertisements deal with the heart, trying to create an emotion or trying to create an emotional tie with their product and the person. In the same sort of way, you have to defamiliarize some messages, whether it's whether it's educational, whether it's political, whether it's an advertising or whatever area you're working in, you have to figure out how to do that. And so I want you to read this book, and I want you to apply it to the area you think is best for you. And this is, of course, is done in the media as well. The easy one to see is look at something like Lewis's Screwtape Letters. Screwtape Letters is very powerful because it's not directed at any one person. It's a senior devil writing a junior devil, okay? And so you can listen in, and there's all those different letters. Not all those letters apply to you, but some of them do. In the same sort of way, we can see that Overhearing the Gospel by Craddock really comes from an idea that Kierkegaard experienced that he had happened to him when he was a young man walking through the middle of Denmark. There's apparently a cemetery that is also a garden, kind of garden cemetery, beautiful place that people would go and walk and meditate and think. And he was sitting on a bench meditating one day, and there were some trees and bushes around him, and a grandfather and a grandchild came up on the other side of the bush, so they didn't see Kierkegaard sitting there, and began a conversation. And by the time Kierkegaard realized it was that they were really it was over a grave of the grandfather's son, the grandchild's father. So it was the father to the grandson, and the son of the grandfather. And it was a passionate plea by that grandfather for the grandson to not follow in the footsteps of his father, but to follow in the footsteps of Christ. And as Kierkegaard sat there, at first he thought he should leave, but then he knew he would disturb them, and since he didn't know they were there, he just didn't know what to do, so he just ended up staying there and listening to this. And he said the power of that overhearing was so influential on his life that he never forgot it. And he said the precise reason he never forgot it is that message was never directed at him. It gave him a chance to kind of step back and be objective and think about that message that the grandfather was giving to the grandson to follow in the footsteps of Christ. And he said he'll never forgot it, and it was so powerful because he overheard the message. And the message then was powerful. So I want you to read this book. You don't have to read all the sermons at the end. I don't care about that. I want you to get the idea and then try to apply it to your area, whether it's PR, advertising, other forms of communication. This whole idea of indirect communication is so influential and needed, I think, in a culture that is so bent on information being the issue, argument being the issue, propositions being the issue, when in fact sometimes, now there are times to be direct, but sometimes you need indirect. When you know that there's that emotional barrier or an informational misinformation that people have, then you need to deal with that misinformation or that emotion. And you do that indirectly through veiled communication so that the person can make sense out of that themselves. All right, so I hope this helps kind of frame this book and why I have this book in there. We are looking forward to your reviews. They're due on the 14th, which is Friday. It would be great if you could get them done by then. And I look forward to reading them. Have a great week. God bless you. Bye-bye.